This is TWiT.
It is time for a blast from the past, a trip into the past.
This one I've
something
had,
like
at
that.
least. I'm ecstatic.
Well, it has gotten very funny on how we do a whiskey you've never heard of, because people keep bringing me weird whiskeys, and I love them. But this is the last of the classic malts. I felt like it was just time to. I shouldn't have been last. It's a great whiskey, and it's the Thalas Gair 10, which is on the Isle of Skye. It's located in a little town, in a little village called Carbust, which is on the Mingus Peninsula on the Isle of Skye. The Isle of Skye is the largest of the Inner Hebrides island. If you ever see a picture of it or you look at it on Google Maps, you'll see it sort of looks like a wing, although it does have a non-trivial set of mountains on it. It's important to remember that this was the land going back 20,000 years that when Doggerland was still exposed, before it became the North Sea. So this is all connected together, and people have been there for a very long time. Some of the earliest documentation of it goes all the way back to folks like Ptolemy in the Romans. He actually drew a map of it, and it was named Skytis, which is apparently a Celtic word for winged, because if you look at the land, it looks sort of wing-shaped. There's plenty of evidence there that there were humans that going back to the Mesolithic period. For those who are not up on their ancient history, this is Mesolithic meaning Middle Stone Age, as opposed to the Paleolithic and the Neolithic. What that actually means is the Mesolithics were probably the last of the hunter-gatherers. So this is 7 to 17,000 years ago. So tail end of the Ice Age kind of stuff. As opposed to the Neolithics, this is really when farming starts to emerge, at least in that part of the world. Although there's evidence that, and this is what's found in some of these sites in Skye, that the Mesolithics were starting to make pottery as well as stone tools and the like. And humans persisted in that area the entire time as the ocean rose up and cut off those islands and made them into islands. You go all the way through to the Iron Age. You have the Picts. There's writings about the Isle of Skye in Ireland from 700 AD. And the Vikings, of course, controlled this area. We've talked about the Hebrides before, all the way down to the Isle of Man, all sort of resolved back into what would become the Scotland with the Treaty of Perth in 1266. What do you need to know about Skye? This is the land of the Clan MacLeod. Yeah, the movie. Nice. But Dunvegan Castle has been the seat of that clan and is still an operable castle going back to the 13th century. So like I said, the lineages are long there. And of course, being in Scotland means they went through all of the troubles with the English, forced immigration, turning all the land into sheep farms, the famines, the pushing people into the other countries. In the middle 1800s, when the Talisker distillery is founded, there's about 20,000 people living on Skye. By 1970, there's barely 7,000. Today, it's around 10. It may be an island, but there is a bridge, weirdly named the Skye Bridge, that connects it onto there. There's also a ferry available. And the business there these days is primarily tourism-centric. So lots of nature walks, great mountain climbing, scenic views. Talisker has been the only distillery on there since it was the only distillery started back in 1830. It's been there a very long time, although in 2017, the Torabhag distillery opened up. And so now there's, I think, just 3 or 4, right? I already mentioned Raasay, which is a little island right beside Skye, so it nominally doesn't count, but it's roughly in the same region. There is a whiskey called the Isle of Skye. It is not made on Skye. I've talked about it on the show. It's actually made in Glasgow. Let's not confuse those things. So Hugh MacAskill leases the land from the MacLeod clan in the 1830s. He does not name it for the village it's in. He names it for his estate, Talisker. And there's a bankruptcy. There's some changing of hands. In 1880, it gets a major rebuild. Then we come into the 20th century. Distillers Company buys it in 1925. This will eventually be acquired by Diageo, and of course, it's been owned by Diageo since the very beginning. Their distilling process was unusual. There's strong Irish influence because up until 1928, they were triple distilling, which is very much an Irish thing with smaller stills. But in 1928, they switched over to follow the Scottish convention of twice distilled, a low wine still and a spirit still. Famously, in 1960, there was a major fire that burned the entire distillery to the ground. And there was a big push to literally remake the original 5 stills in every detail. Took them a couple of years, and they still use those remade stills from 1960 to this day. So 2 wash stills of about 10,000 liters each, which are quite small, relatively speaking. Straight lie arms, which is unusual. So the swan neck comes up and it just goes straight out. They have 3 spirit still, also unusual. They're smaller, 7,500 liters. They don't have a reflex bulb, so one of the characters that we talk about in the Talisker whiskey is quite spicy, and there's an argument it's because there's less reflux, so more of those sharper flavors stay in with the whiskey over time. Use stainless steel mash tuns and wooden washbacks. This is very sort of standard stuff, and in the case of Talisker 10, at least, they age entirely in bourbon casks. And this, as I mentioned before, is one of the whiskeys of the classic malts of Scotland in 1988. This was a United Distillers promotion. And normally I wouldn't talk so much about marketing stuff, but this keeps coming up because it literally changed the path of whiskey. So whiskey did very well coming out of World War II in the 1950s and 60s. But as the economic doldrums of the 70s came in with the OPEC crisis and while runaway inflation, people turned to cheaper drinks. The other thing that happened, especially in America, was that soft drinks became very cheap. The advent of liquefied sugar, of high fructose corn syrup, cut the price of soda in half because they didn't need to use real sugar anymore. And so the highball became the drink, right? A Bacardi and Coke, that kind of thing, all pushed by spirits manufacturers, and whiskey sales dropped tremendously through the 70s and the early 80s. And then in 1988, this promotion came out. And what United Distillers was doing was they made a package, essentially, of 8 whiskeys. They called them the classic malts, and they were supposed to be all from different regions. And the fact that Talisker is by itself on Skye is that, for the most part, Talisker has always been referred to as just part of Islay, because it's also a peated whiskey, like all of the whiskeys are in Islay. That's not how United Distillers referred to it. United Distillers broke down these 8 whiskeys into, or these 7 whiskeys into 7 regions. So there was a lowland, which is a generally recognized region. That was the Glenkinchie. There was a Speyside, Cragganmore, which we've obviously talked about. Then there was Lagavulin, the Islay. And then there was, they messed with the Highlands. They created 2 different regions of Highlands. So the Dalwhinnie 15 was considered a Highland, but so was the Oban 14, which is also Highland, but they called it West Highland, which admittedly, it's on the west side of the Highlands, but so is Dalwhinnie. So, okay. They didn't mention Campbelltown, which is generally a recognized region, but United Distillers should have known a distillery there, so just leave that out. And then, of course, they called the Talisker 10 the Skye whiskey, which admittedly it is, and was at that time the only one, and it had been for like 150 years until 2017 when some of these others started opening up. At the time of the promotion, Talisker was producing 1.5 million liters a year of whiskey, which sounds like a lot. But within a few years, that doubled. Today, they make 3.5 million liters of whiskey a year. So the change was astonishing, the growth in the marketplace. And oddly enough, and this was not expected by United Distillers, they admitted as much, it was the peated whiskeys that did best. Both Lagavulin and Talisker just took off and became this huge product. And for the most part, Talisker really just made a 10. Only when it was bought by when Diageo took over in the 90s did they start making others. They made an 18 for a while, although it's periodic. In the early 2010s, when whiskey was doing so well that they simply didn't lay up enough, like you can't make a 12-year in less than 12 years. So when you start to run low, what do? So they started producing specialty versions without year notifications. Like if it has a 10 on it, it means that's the youngest thing in the bottle, right? But when they call it Storm, it's a 4-year-old, man. Like, and you don't want to put a 4 on the bottle. So you get these very young whiskeys when they don't want the names. They just blend them together to get a flavor profile that people like. So there are a bunch of unusual versions. In fact, Diageo has taken over that whole concept of the classic malts. They still release them, but now they do customized versions of them where they'll take the regular whiskey, but they'll do like a 6-month finishing in a sherry cask. So you can only find it in the collection. Normally, these were sold together. So the whole idea, one of the reasons it was so effective, it's like, hey, you can order this as a block and you'll get a good price on it. And so you get these 7 different whiskeys on your shelf all at once called the classic malts. And it's what, again, because they presumed the Cragganmore was going to be the hit and the Lagavulin ended up being the hit, they got bars to take on whiskeys they wouldn't ordinarily take on, and it worked. So you can go find the more expensive variants like this. There's the new release literally this year is called Talisker, the Wild Explorador. It's $140. Don't buy this. What the? It has no year on it. Like, what are you doing?
It's funny.
Anyway, by the 10. The 10 is lovely. It is colored. Right? They have a consistency thing. It is chill filtered. It's 46%. Actually, they market it as 45.8. I'll call that 46%. It's not a strongly peated whiskey. You know what I really like about Talisker? It tastes like it's on the ocean. It's got that little iodine nose, like that sense of the sea, a little bit of saltiness in the palate. And you really don't smell the peat going in, but a little smokiness shows up later. Like you had a fire on the beach. That's what it's like drinking that stuff. It's strictly aged in bourbon casks, so there's nothing fancy there. And yeah, but it's clearly from an island. And you can find it at Bevmo for about $75. It's absolutely worth having on your shelf. And if you're peat curious, this is a good place to start.
I'm listening.
You know, a lot of people got confronted with an Ardbeg or a Lagavulin the first time they taste whiskey, say, I don't like whiskey. And to that person, I hand them like a Dalmore 18 and ruin their lives. Now, you love a $200 bottle of whiskey because that thing drinks like smooth caramel. But when you want to start flirting with other flavors and people say, well, I'm kind of afraid of peats, it's like, yeah, try the Talisker 10. Don't do the Ardbeg 10. The Ardbeg 10 is like, I really have an urge to lick a forest fire. Like, Ardbeg will deliver. But if you want to come in slowly, come in with the Talisker.